Okay, let's dive into this. Have you ever wondered how a seemingly small, decentralized group of farmers practically woke up one day and decided to conquer an entire subcontinent? Well, today's explainer is going to walk you through exactly that. We're looking at one of history's most insane, fast-paced, 15-year startup stories, the absolute rise and the devastating fall of the Maratha Empire.
And right here, this is the architect of it all, Shivaji. He was the visionary founder, the guy who took a scattered population of agricultural workers and somehow transformed them into an absolute powerhouse. We're talking a formidable military and a highly tuned administrative machine.
Now, to really grasp this, you have to understand the sheer scale of the disruption we're talking about here. At the time, the mighty Mughal Empire practically held a monopoly over India. They were the undisputed heavyweights. But this group, an agricultural people from the hilly Western Ghats, managed to rise up and completely topple that dominance. It set the stage for an epic underdog story that literally redefined the 18th century. So, to understand exactly how they pulled this off, we're going to break it down into 5 key stages. First, the rise of the Marathas. Second, their clash with the Mughals. Third, the Maratha administrative machine. Fourth, the rise of the Peshwas. And finally, number 5, the road to Panipat.
All right, Section 1, Rise of the Marathas, the foundation of a startup empire.
It is honestly incredible just how humble these origins are. Before Shivaji came along, the Marathas were mostly engaged in agriculture, just kind of scattered across South India, mostly natives of the hilly Western Ghats in present-day Maharashtra. But Shivaji, who was born in 1627 in the Shivneri fortress, well, he had the absolute perfect foundational background for a startup founder. His mother, Jijabai, infused him with this fierce, unyielding spirit to defend his nation and his religion. And then he was tutored by Dada Jakandadev, who basically molded him into an expert soldier and an incredibly efficient administrator. Plus, he was deeply inspired by religious reformers of the time, guys like Eknath, Tukaram, and Ramdas. So you mix that military skill with this intense ideological drive, boom, it was an explosive combination.
Move into Section 2, Clash with the Mughals, defying an established monopoly.
Now, look, this journey was definitely not a smooth ride. It was a roller coaster of massive setbacks and unbelievable comebacks. Shivaji started aggressively scaling his territory, right? He began ravaging Mughal lands, even defeating Aurangzeb's own viceroy of the Deccan, Shaista Khan. But then Aurangzeb claps back. He sends Raja Jai Singh, who besieges Shivaji and actually forces him into the 1665 Treaty of Purandar, making him hand over 23 of his forts. A huge blow. Then, a year later, Shivaji visits the Mughal court in Agra, gets treated terribly, and ends up a prisoner. But, and here's the crazy part, he manages to escape after just 3 months. No way, right? After that, he becomes this relentless, implacable enemy of the Mughals, reconquers almost all of his lost forts, and in 1674 assumes the supreme title of Chhatrapati at Raigad. Sadly, he passed away in 1680 at just 53 years old due to a fever. But as we know, an empire doesn't survive its founder on sheer charisma alone. It needs a rock-solid structure.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Maratha administrative machine, the engine that powered the empire.
So the really crucial point here is how Shivaji actually structured all this territory. It was brilliant. He essentially divided it into 2 distinct categories. On one hand, you had Swarajya. This was the territory directly under his administrative rule. And on the other hand, you had Mughalai. Now, Mughalai wasn't directly managed by the Marathas. Instead, it was the surrounding territory, belonging to the Mughals or the Deccan Sultanates, that the Marathas basically forced into economic submission.
And how exactly did they do that? Well, through a brutal yet brilliant piece of economic warfare known as the chaff. This was a massive tax, 25% of the gross revenue of those neighboring territories. And why did the neighbors cough it up? Very simply, to avoid being raided by Maratha forces. Think of it like a highly effective, state-sponsored protection fee.
But he didn't stop there. Oh no. On top of that 25% chauth, Shivaji slapped on an additional 10% premium called the Sardeshmukhi. He claimed this extra tax strictly based on his status as the Sardeshmukh, meaning he was the supreme overlord of the region. So 35% right off the top, just like that.
Meanwhile, back in their direct territory, their internal administrative structure was incredibly methodical. The kingdom was divided into these massive provinces called prants. Those were then systematically sliced down into districts called tarfs, which were then broken into sub-districts called parganas, all the way down to the individual villages, known as mauses. It was just a remarkably tight, well-organized hierarchy.
And the roles within the system? Just as hyper-specialized. You had the Mamathar acting as the provincial governor, working with a council. Law enforcement was neatly split up. The Faujdar handled the rural areas, while the Kotwal took care of the urban spots. But you really want to pay attention to the Kamavizdar. These were Brahmin elites who maintained the records, judged cases, and crucially, fed local intelligence straight up the chain of command. This specific role was so effective that later on the British actually modeled their own district collector office entirely on the Maratha Kamavizdar. Pretty wild, right? So we have this amazing startup with a rock-solid operational engine. But naturally, after Shivaji's death, things get incredibly messy, leading to a massive restructuring.
Let's look at Section 4, Rise of the Peshwas, a massive corporate restructuring.
Right, so following Shivaji's death, the empire just plunges into this chaotic struggle for succession. It's a total mess. Shivaji's son, Sambhaji, gets captured and executed by the Mughals in 1689. Then Rajaram steps in to rule on behalf of the young Shahu, but he's constantly on the run from Mughal forces. By 1707, it's a full-blown civil war between Shahu and his aunt Tarabai. The empire is split right down the middle. All this internal chaos meant their old system just wasn't cutting it anymore.
To stabilize things, they executed what we'd call today a massive corporate pivot. A totally new system evolved under the leadership of Balaji Vishwanath, who held the title of Peshwa, or Prime Minister. Under this new structure, the royal family, the Chhatrapatis, they stayed over in Satara, but they basically became mere title or figureheads. Meanwhile, all the real, functional power shifted entirely to Pune. That's where the Peshwas started calling the shots and ruling as the true functional heads of the Maratha Empire.
And wow, under the Peshwas, the Marathas didn't just stabilize, they absolutely exploded in scale. Balaji Vishwanath's son, Bajirao I, expanded their control over Malwa, Gujarat, and Bundelkhand, and he actually made the office of the Peshwa completely hereditary. Then his successor, Balaji Bajirao, aggressively scaled things even further. We're talking pushing into Bengal, forcing Mysore to pay tribute, and utterly crushing the Nizam of Hyderabad at Ugir in 1760. By 1752, they had literally reached Delhi to help install a new vizier, and they brought the Punjab under their control. I mean, they were effectively running the Indian subcontinent at this point. But, as you might guess, with massive, aggressive expansion comes equally massive risk.
Which brings us to our final chapter, Section 5, The Road to Panipat, the Great Crash.
You see, expanding into the Punjab brought the Marathas into direct, and ultimately fatal, conflict with the Afghan ruler Ahmed Shah Abdali. And this brings us to a really devastating turning point. On January 14, 1761, the inevitable collision finally happened. The Maratha and Afghan forces met head-on at the Third Battle of Panipat.
Now at Panipat, the face of Maratha leadership looked a bit different. The Peshwa had dispatched a massive army, technically under the command of his minor son, but the actual guy calling the shots on the battlefield was his cousin, Sadashiv Rao Bao, and they were staring down an incredibly dire threat from the north. The outcome? It was an absolute tragedy for the Marathas. To quote our sources directly, the Peshwa's son Vishwas Rao, Sadashiv Rao Bao, and numerous other Maratha commanders perished in the battlefield. They were definitively, utterly defeated. And the sheer weight of this tragic loss was so overwhelming that the Peshwa himself, Nana Sahib, actually died from the shock just a few months later, in June of 1761.
Following this devastating crash, the empire just couldn't hold its center anymore. The big Maratha commanders, the Sardars, they started carving out their own semi-independent states up in the north. So you see the rise of the Gayakwad family at Baroda, the Bonsle at Nagpur, the Holkar at Indore, and the Scindia at Gwalior. This massive decentralization led to fierce internal power struggles back in Pune. And of course, all that infighting gave the British the absolute perfect excuse to intervene, kicking off the First Anglo-Maratha War in 1775.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating final thought to ponder here. The Maratha Empire was one of history's most brilliant examples of rapid scaling and disruption. I mean, they went from scattered farmers to a continent-spanning powerhouse in a blink of an eye historically. But once it reached that massive scale, heavily relying on semi-independent commanders and this complex web of economic dominance, could any single central authority ever truly hope to hold it all together forever? It's a pretty compelling question about the limits of imperial growth. Well, I really hope this explainer helped you visualize and understand the incredible machinery behind the Maratha Empire. Keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next one.